Welcome to the 54th episode of the Jewish Drinking Show. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan, and I'm excited to have on first-time guest Mollie
Buddy,
Lewis.
thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So Mollie here is the sales director for New Riff Distilling, which is in Northern Kentucky. Mollie, what are you drinking this evening?
Well, I am drinking along with you, hopefully, watching the show. I am starting with our bottled and bond Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey.
Awesome.
This is our flagship product. This is our Kentucky baby.
All right. So I'm joining you. Thank you, Mollie. So I'm joining you. And so we're literally on the same page. So l'chaim.
L'chaim.
Okay. I did a little research. Thank you to the gifts that you provided me. So you not only provided the bourbon, but also the rye. So we've got both the bourbon and the rye. So I was doing a little research pre-show. And as you mentioned, they're both bottled and bond. They're both 100 proof. So I've got poured both the bourbon here and the rye here.
Excellent.
And it's really fascinating because both of them hit the palate fairly smoothly, but they don't end the palate that way. They bring the heat, both at the end of the palate, and really the finish. It's not just the finish; it's like super duper long tail finish. There's just crackling heat and spiciness for more than minutes. It goes a while.
Awesome. That's a great descriptor. I mean, obviously the sign, coming from a wine background, I always think of the sign of a quality product as how long the finish is. So that's a lovely entry.
Awesome. Yeah. So I found it fascinating. I'll be honest, full disclosure, I'm not really a rye person. I'm more of a bourbon person. Bourbon was my gateway whiskey before I found my ultimate love, which was Scotch. But I still like bourbon. Don't get me wrong.
Sure.
And just for those out there, this is a 65% mash bill with corn, 30% of rye, and then 5% of my favorite grain, which is malted barley.
Very
So
cool.
it has a little bit of that nuttiness from that barley, which is cool. But definitely, as far as bourbons go, it packs the spice, right?
Absolutely. You know, I mean, we're in Kentucky, and bourbon is our thing in Kentucky, and we're really proud of our corn source. And hopefully later in the program we can get into some of those details about where that is and what not. But you know, we fell in love with rye very early, and we realized that people were they weren't sure about rye most of the time because they had tried ryes that were very young. Mm-hmm. Or ryes that really hit them in the face, you know, that just like you would taste it and you go, I can't drink this. So we were really set out early on to prove that rye can actually be a really, really elegant drink if aged properly and handled properly, because it is certainly more finicky than corn, which is why our bourbon, which Drew and I are both enjoying right now, it has what we would call a high rye profile. So these bourbons are designed to be specifically big, bold, in your face, but also elegant at the same time.
And spicy.
Super spicy, which is a big descriptor of rye in general. Absolutely.
Right. And like I said, one of the things that struck me, I really came in my prejudice coming into a high rye was that it would be spicy right off the bat, but it actually hits the palate fairly smoothly. It's got nice legs, which is really nice. And then it finishes with that deep spice, but it comes out nicely.
Yeah.
It's not immature. It has a maturity to it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things, to get right into it, that we decided when we decided to open the distillery, you know, the difference between our distillery and perhaps others around is that our distillery was really a passion project for Ken Lewis, who used to own the Party Source. So anybody out there who's watching,
and also your father. And also your father.
My father. You're right. Yeah. Yes, you're right, Drew. But anyone who's local to the Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky area, gosh, or even Louisville or even Columbus, knows the Party Source is really a go-to destination for shopping.
Even Central Ohio, really?
You know, the story is, when I was a teenager, you know, I'm dating myself here, back in the 80s, but the story is that folks used to drive from as far as Central Ohio to shop at the Party Source because the pricing was so much better. because Ohio, unfortunately, is state controlled. So
Yeah.
pricing is all the same no matter where you go. So,
I'm from Columbus originally.
oh,
So
there you go.
yeah, so that
That's
drive is not
now.
an easy one just for some bourbon or, anything.
Yeah, people made a road trip out of it, right? A day trip, but
Yeah.
that's the legend, if you will. But in founding the distillery, the impetus behind it, Ken fell in love with bourbon and being a Kentuckian and really wanting to promote our native spirit. But um, he really wanted to make sure that everything was done right. So, when you talk about the rye being of age, or when you talk about things being mature in their taste profile, that was something that was really important to us from the get-go. We did not release a single drop of whiskey until it was at least 4 years old.
Wow.
So our first distillations were in June of 2014, but we didn't release a single bottle of whiskey until August 2018. So not to get too far ahead of some of the questions I imagine are in the pipeline, but aging the bourbon at least 4 years was really important to us, and the rye. I mean, aging any whiskey that we released, because we really felt like there was a fair amount of younger product out there that just wasn't ready.
Talking about the origins, 2018, 2014. So let's just go back in history.
Sure.
How did, and we already mentioned Ken Lewis, your father, started the distillery. What's the story behind it? And you mentioned the Party Source also, which I don't know if people know, shares the exact same parking lot as New Riff. So what's the origin story for New Riff?
Yeah, no. So we are a Kentucky family. I was born in Louisville, Kentucky, and Ken, in fact, was born in Louisville, Kentucky. Both of his parents were made their way to Kentucky from Illinois, and my grandfather was subsequently from Rochester, where his parents immigrated from Russia. So they moved to Kentucky originally for an opportunity. They were my grandfather was in the surplus business and Army surplus. He sold goods of all kinds and had a liquor department in his store at one point. And my father was interested in being an English teacher. He was a hippie, to an extent. He was a scholar and, had this opportunity in the liquor world to make some money that was going to supposedly at that time enable him to building a school. He was really good at it. He found that he had a knack for it. He found that there was competition that was, friendly in Kentucky, and really started his career. So his businesses started in Louisville. He saw a possibility of creating a large, almost Costco-sized store on the border of Kentucky and Ohio. Nothing like that had been done before. And his vision for that was, because we alluded to that earlier, in Ohio, the pricing for liquor especially was always state controlled. So the idea was that pricing was always very much less expensive in Kentucky, and folks would travel. He had a vision that folks would travel in. Really? He was an entrepreneur, a risk taker, and he built this store. Everybody thought he was crazy. It was big. Nobody had seen a store, an alcohol store, a liquor store to this size, but it ended up being a huge success. And because of that, because of its size and stature eventually, he had access to all the great whiskeys, not just from Kentucky and mainly from Kentucky, but from all over the world. So, he always, if you came to the store back then in the late 80s and saw him walking around, he had a tag on his, his shirt that always said that he was just the liquor buyer. He has always been very humble about his position and his businesses. And he fell in love with whiskey. He got opportunities to try all the great stuff coming out of Kentucky.
Totally understandable to fall in love with whiskey.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation about whiskey, because the last 2 episodes have also featured whiskey as the featured topic. Just last week, we had a conversation with Joshua Schwartz about storing whiskey and beer in containers that previously held Gentile wine. And the previous week before that, we had Rabbi Chaim Litvin, who is the bourbon rabbi, talking about bourbon in Kentucky.
In 2001, a gentleman by the name of Jay Arisman, who has a fabulous palate, who also comes from an intellectual education background, landed a job as the fine spirits buyer at the Party Source. And he and Ken dreamed up the idea of building the distillery. And Ken had a passion for whiskey, had the mind for the finances and how actually to put the logistics into place. And Jay is really a savant when it comes to whiskey and fine spirits, and his palate is really second to none. And because his specialty was fine spirit buying for the Party Source for so long, he built relationships with all the major, we refer to them as the heritage distilleries across Kentucky. So he had lots of resources. You know, luckily, even to date, the community in Kentucky is very friendly, and people love to share information and exchange ideas and such. So there was a lot of support for them to start a distillery, but it was a big move.
How many have there been? Is it frequent that new distilleries start up in Kentucky, at least in the last couple of decades?
You know, lately more than ever before. Well, I shouldn't say that. I mean, you know, since Prohibition, and then with the bourbon decline in the late 70s, early 80s, lately there have been many, many more distilleries popping up than ever. There are a fair amount of craft distilleries that are popping up, and also there's a lot of international investment right now in Kentucky. You know, we like to base our, you know, the question that everybody tries to ask is, how long is this boom going to last? You know, and a lot of us base our predictions on expansion and things like that on all the investment that's already happening in Kentucky currently.
Because I know already a half decade ago, there was already a boom underway, and it doesn't, and I know that even the cooperages were struggling to keep up with demand.
You're absolutely right about that.
Still at the end of this past decade, already in 2020, I'm surprised. I mean, it's impressive that there's still been quite the growth, and certainly the interest in the craft distilling space.
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, just the world is paying attention to spirits now. Not that the world is not drinking wine still, but there is a trend in spirit consumption. Cocktails are trendy. People are making them at home. People are interested in finer products to put in their cocktails and learning more about whiskey in general. And so there is a lot of movement. You know, we like to say at this point in Kentucky, there are 2 barrels for every person living in the state. 2 barrels laying down of whiskey. That's a true statistic at this point. But yeah, I would say, you know, our distillery, we started dreaming it up in about 2010. We really didn't distill anything until June of 2014. At the time of our first distillation, there were what we would call 7 heritage distilleries, and probably 7 what would be considered in the craft world. I think the total was 13, so maybe 6 or 7. And then it has grown now to over 30 distilleries in the state of Kentucky. So wow. The expansion has been quick. Again, there's a lot of international money coming in. But I will say—
And still a lot of demand. And still a lot of demand.
However, you know, the secret that we don't like to let out in Kentucky is that you can make bourbon anywhere in the 50 United States. So there's also a trend in growth in other states too. I know in the state of Washington, there are tremendous craft distilleries on the rise, and you know, Colorado.
Breckenridge makes a good whiskey, makes a good bourbon.
Yeah, I mean, there's some fabulous mines making fabulous juice out there. So, you know,
but still, it's 85-90% of the world's bourbon is out of Kentucky.
We always say 95% of the world's bourbon is coming from Kentucky, and we say 99% of the quality is coming from Kentucky. I don't know if everyone would agree, but that's what we certainly say.
That's good. That's good. So you mentioned earlier, as far as the rye. So what are the core products, and how did you come across rye as sort of a foundational aspect of the identity of New Riff?
Yeah, great question. Well, because of Jay's relationships at the party.
And just for full disclosure, I've moved on to the rye.
Oh, good.
So that's my glass didn't suddenly fill with more bourbon. It just has rye now.
Okay. And the mash bill on our rye, well, let me talk a little bit about the history of our rye, and then that'll directly lead us to the mash bill. We were very lucky because when we opened our doors or planned to open our doors, we were in contact with a gentleman named Larry Ebersold. Larry Ebersold was for over 30 years the master distiller at what is now referred to as MGP. Before it was LDI, and before that was the Seagram's plant over in Lawrenceburg, Indiana.
Okay.
So Larry Ebersold, I can safely say, is one of the best master distillers for rye in the world, if not the best.
Wow.
He happened to have just retired.
Mm-hmm.
He happened to live in northern Kentucky, and he happened to be friendly with Jay through Jay's contact with MGP and buying products for the Party Source. So it was one of these serendipitous moments. A lot of things about New Riff have been very serendipitous, and Larry was our consulting master distiller. So we were his first consulting project. And he came in and taught us really how to build the distillery, where to put the fermenters, where to run pipes and things. And probably the most important thing that he taught us was to fall in love with rye and not be afraid to work with it. So,
what convinced you about rye? Like, what was his pitch? Where had you been before that?
Well, we hadn't distilled anything before that. So we had just been dreaming up some mash bills. Early on, before we started distilling our own product, we had bought about 300 and some odd barrels from MGP, or, it was LDI at the time, of high rye bourbon. You might have heard of a brand that was in existence for a couple of years called OKI. Okay. OKI stands for Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana, and it was a brand that we cultivated based on, it was this MGP juice. So with the mash bill was 60% corn, 35% rye, and 5% malted barley. So slightly different variation from what you're drinking now, or what you were drinking with your
slightly spicier too.
It was a little bit spicier, MGP, LDI, and Seagram's were big rye proponents because Larry had such a handle on producing rye. In fact, some of the world's most renowned rye brands actually started and were purchased juice from MGP. It's a large industrial plant. Some argue making some of the best rye-based products in the country. So Larry really had a handle on rye. Rye is a very finicky grain. It's gummier than corn. Corn is much smoother in the still and things. Rye is sticky. It gums up. When you're fermenting in a large scale fermenter, there's a big cap on top. If you think about rye bread, sometimes it's got more flavor. It's got more oomph. Corn is a little easier to work with. So, a lot of distillers are afraid of rye, or they don't want to deal with it. There are a lot of distilleries, even in Kentucky, that make wheated bourbon that don't even mess with rye, to be honest, that like those flavor profiles better. But Larry really taught us to work with rye. He shared his passion for rye. We had purchased this juice already that was high rye, so it became something we became eager to work with. Wow. So that's it, a number of factors, but that's one of the main factors that went into our mash bill, our designing of our New Riff mash bill. We're a click down from that rye percentage. So like you said earlier, we're 30% rye.
Yeah. And so what constitutes a high rye? Which percentage what you're working with, the 30% is already pretty high, but where does it transition from sort of not high rye to high rye?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And Jay is my source for all of this information. There's nothing that's written that declares rye bill high or not. Generally, anything over about 18%, people start referring to as a higher rye mash bill.
You're way beyond that.
We are way beyond that. To our knowledge, to my knowledge, in the industry for bourbon, Four Roses and what's coming out of MGP at that 35% is the highest rye mash bill that we know of for bourbon. Okay. Mm-hmm. So we're just a click under. But yeah, anywhere between that 18 to 35%, one could get away with referring to it as a higher rye product.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
So you have, here I showed the bourbon and the rye that you supplied me with, and what other products do you make? I think I had a friend of mine share with me a cast strength of yours, a bourbon.
Yeah.
So are they typically fairly high rye, or is rye is a really popular grain, I imagine?
Yeah. So, well, our mash bill, between whether it's cask strength or I have a bottle of it right here, actually, our bottled in bond bourbon, what we call our bottled in bond bourbon, or our flagship that Drew and I
Yeah.
are both drinking tonight. This is always 100 proof.
Okay.
So in order to be called bottled in bond is the highest quality control for a spirit in the history of spirit controls. It came about in the late 1800s. It was a way to really control what was in the bottle. What was written on the bottle was actually what was in the bottle. You know, people were trying to get away with all kinds of things, putting ethanol and formaldehyde and all kinds of weird things in products. So when you called your product bottled in bond, it had to adhere to certain regulations. One of the most important regulations was that it was exactly 100 proof. So not 99 proof, not 101 proof, but 100 proof. Had to be at least 4 years old, had to be distilled, aged, and bottled in the same location, and had to be from the same season. So there are a number of restrictions that make becoming bottled in bond sort of a tough play. That was another quality move that we started out with. We decided if we were going to make bourbon, we wanted even our entry level to be bottled in bond.
Wow.
So we do produce one other bourbon currently. Well, we produce a couple of specialty things, but one other core item, and that is our single barrel bourbon.
Okay.
And that is, those are individual barrels that are bottled, and they are always at cask strength. So,
so that's what I must have had.
You must have had that, right? Exactly. Yeah. And the proof varies slightly between, obviously between the barrels and what rick they're aged at and where and things like that. But that is the only proof difference between our bottled in bond is our cask strength, and the mash bills are the same. So 65 corn, 30 rye, and 5% malted barley. Yeah. I didn't mention the rye mash bill. So our rye mash bill is also fun. Yes. It's 95% rye and 5% malted rye. One of the other gifts that Larry gave us was that he taught us the famous MGP recipe. Many of you might have had it in bullet rye, for example, started at MGP. And the bullet recipe is 95% rye. They don't advertise it. It's not on the bottle, but Larry taught us that it's 95% rye, 5% malted barley. So knowing that, we played with that. We said, well, we want to put our riff on it, or our spin on the flavors. And so instead of malted barley, we're using malted rye. So it's a big rye bomb. I mean, if you think the bourbon has spice to it, wait till you try the rye.
Yep.
Yeah. Another many reason to age it for a minimum of 4 years. So those flavors and those spice bomb components can sort of integrate with the wood and calm down a little bit. And be ready to drink.
I hope you've been enjoying the show so far. I'm really excited for next week's guest, the 55th episode. This is returning guest, Professor Jordan Rosenblum, and we are talking about the Rabbinic Drinking House. Here's a sneak peek.
I think you have to take the words seriously, right? Why else? Because people gloss it over. That's what it means. But why is it and weddings involve drinking. Celebration involves drinking. Rabbinic literature always says there's no joy without wine, right?
I hope you enjoyed it. And now back into our show.
It's Jewishly owned, Jewishly started. Of course, that brings us to the Jewish drinking component of this, which is, and I know that there actually is, certainly in the 19th century, early in the 20th century, a lot of distilleries in Kentucky have been and still are Jewishly owned. So it's not. Absolutely. It's not the most shocking thing that another Jew would get into the bourbon distilling industry in Kentucky. So how's that been? I mean, maybe that's more for your father, but I imagine he's certainly shared with you along the way. Have you connected? Like, what's it like?
It's a great question, and you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a history of Jewish-owned distilleries in Kentucky. Two of the largest that are still owned by Jewish individual families are Heaven Hill Distillery. Heaven Hill is one of the larger ones in Kentucky, but the Sazerac Group is also owned by a Jewish family. So those who produce
Buffalo Trace,
exactly, are Jewish families. So, I was doing a little homework before our interview as well. The correlations between Jews and distilling are, subjective. Jewish people obviously have always been quite entrepreneurial. Whiskey has always been quite a lucrative trade. So the two hand in hand make sense for some of the most important and some of the best run distilleries to be owned by Jews. Yeah. Being Jewish, we've always been a Reformed Jewish family. So we've always enjoyed, the culture of Judaism. It wasn't something that was part of why he founded New Riff, but it certainly plays a part in his character and our family. Absolutely.
That's really great. And now I want to get to the real question I really am excited to ask you about, which is, I know the last two Passovers, New Riff has sold, your father has sold the whiskey, the chametz of it, for Passover, for Pesach, for Passover, so that the chametz, the leavened bread, as it were, the leavened grains are not owned by a Jew over Passover. So how did that come about, and how has that been for you?
That's a very interesting story, and you're absolutely right. It actually, that tradition started when Ken still owned the Party Source.
Really?
It did, because that, chametz is also if you own the store, and it's a Jewish-owned store, right? And the products are in the store over Passover. So he was not aware of the need to do this early on in his career. And it was brought to his attention by a group of Orthodox Jews from New York who became great whiskey customers of Jay Ehrman's, actually, at the Party Source. In all honesty, I mean, they were able to get things that they weren't able to get in New York and whatnot.
Which by the way, I think that's a secret that's not well known, is that Orthodox Jews actually really like their distilled spirits.
Oh, they sure do. I don't know what a secret that is. That's not a secret in our household or in our world. Some of our best customers and closest friends are Orthodox Jews who really enjoy our products. So, so historically, I would say starting in the early 2000s, Ken would sell all of the chametz or everything to someone for the period of Passover and then buy it back. And he continued that tradition into New Riff. So we do that. It's very informal. We have a rabbi, you might know Rabbi Avraham Weinrib.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he's the rabbi of Congregation Zichron Eliezer.
Okay, great. So he is our rabbi who helps us with that process and officiates and makes it legit. And, it's a wonderful thing. It's our nod to our history. It's our nod to our consumers. And we just believe it's the right thing to do.
That's wonderful. And I'm glad that it's been going on, and hopefully it'll continue going on.
We absolutely plan to. One of the things about New Riff that also sets us apart from other distilleries in Kentucky is that we're not positioning ourselves. We never started to position ourselves to be sold. We're a family-owned business. My father actually owns half. My mother owns the other half. We plan to keep it in the family, so we can make these decisions and not have to, worry about that not being the case down the road. As long as we remain family, there's no reason why it wouldn't. Yeah,
and that's really great. And speaking of family, how did you come to be a part of it? So it's not just your father who created it and your mother who owns equity in the company, but how did you become part of New Riff?
I think my father always was trying to get me to come into the business on one level or another. He taught me to drink wine. When I was of age, we would drink wine at the family table. I mean, it was very European. Most families in Kentucky, and those times we're not sitting around drinking wine at their dinner table. But he taught me to enjoy and respect beverages as being part of the table, being part of the meal. So I always had a real fondness for wine. My background is in the arts. I love painting. I'm an art nerd, if you will. But I did move out in my mid-20s to California to get into the wine business. And I believe the impetus was, that I would go out for a few years to California and learn about wine and have a few other jobs and then eventually come back. And I fell in love with the wine industry, which is a whole nother, passion of mine, but ended up working my way up in different positions in the wine industry. But then when I knew that that New Riff was on the horizon.
Wait. Before we get to New Riff, what about your own wine background? What was you mentioned the impetus, but like, what's your own personal impetus? What's your passion about wine? What drove you in that industry?
I love wine. I love wine for a number of reasons. I love the people that make it. I do correlate my artistic background with my love for wine and actually my love for New Riff and a lot of craft distilleries. There's an art behind it. There's an art to making wine. Every year it's different. Every year there are a number of factors that make it a very, interesting thing. I mean, depending on the weather, the climate, or, the season, or there's so many factors. When the grapes were picked, with their ripeness, who picked them, how they were handled. So I got really interested in the art of it. I mean, I also really enjoy drinking it. And,
I imagine also a lot of the characteristics of wine, right? And developing a palate and being able to taste various characteristics too.
Absolutely. When I was 25 years old, I was taking a class out in California. I was working in the tasting room at Beringer. Many people might know the name Beringer. It's a pretty large scale winery that produces a lot of different levels of wine. And I remember being in the class, and I remember the teacher saying, it was sort of an introductory class about wine. The teacher said, okay, everybody in this room, does everybody know what chicken tastes like? And of course, we all said, of course, we know chicken. He said, I want you to get to that point with wine. I want you to be able to taste wine and say, I am confident that this is a Merlot, or this is a Sauvignon Blanc, or, and it seemed so daunting at the time, but I was really excited by the challenge of that. And a lot of that is just tasting and retasting and honing your palate and, figuring out characteristics that stand out to you that are reminiscent of the varietal and whatnot. So I was hooked at that point. Worked in different capacities. I mean, from working in a tasting room, I worked in distribution, and I ended up moving to Italy. I lived in Italy actually for 5 years.
Wow. 5 years.
I did.
Wow.
That's a story for we don't have enough time for that on today's episode, but I followed a guy there. And it ended up being a very monumental part of my life, and really learning about the table and Italian culture. And, there's a lot of similarities. My favorite cultures obviously are Jewish culture. That's where I come from, and Italian culture. And there's so many similarities to the table and valuing the family meal and taking your time and everybody sitting together and not rushing. And wine is a part of that, So, I that was always an interest, and then really solidified in Italy. The other thing I learned about in Italy that I find really important is seasonality. I mean, growing up in Kentucky, I didn't realize that strawberries shouldn't be available all year long. I mean, here we are, we have everything at our fingertips in the United States, but, in Italy, you eat peppers when they're in the season, and you eat, just the things that are available at the time. So, I gravitated to that, and the wine pairings that were part of that. Anyway, so I loved the people. I loved the artisanal quality of the small wineries. And when my dad decided that he was going to make this jump and build the distillery, I mean, I was so excited. The idea of being part from ground up of a distillery that was focused on quality, that was going to make, America's native spirit that actually happened to mainly come from my place of birth was pretty exciting. I mean, it had to be pretty exciting to move back from Italy for, right?
Yeah.
So, anyway, it's a good move. I'm proud of it. And it's neat. I feel like we do, we are European in some of our practices. I mean, down to how we focus on hospitality pre-COVID, but our single barrel program and things. I mean, we like to take our time with people. We do a lot of education.
So what about going from a wine, really a heavy wine background, a solid wine background, to bringing those over to a bourbon context? How's that been for you?
I was very nervous about that at first. I mean, in all transparency, you know, this was exciting to me, but I had built my palate and my reputation in the wine world, and I didn't really know much about the bourbon world. And, you know, I wasn't even sure if I really loved bourbon, you know? So it took training. I mean, Jay Arisman, who I've mentioned several times, our co-founder, he's also a very dear friend, really taught me almost everything I know about whiskey, you know, and Jay is actually a wine guy too. I mean, Jay is just like I mentioned before, a savant with spirits and palate. He's a fabulous cook. So I said to Jay, teach me about whiskey, you know, talk to me like a layman, talk to me like I don't know, you know, and he drew so many comparisons between wine and whiskey to make me understand, at least initially. And I really fell in love with whiskey. It's as versatile and as interesting as wine can be. You know, especially when you start talking about the single barrel profiles. You know, every barrel comes from a tree. That particular tree might not be the same tree as the barrel next to it. Maybe it was a different forest. You know, so there's so many variables. Maybe it came from a higher place in the rick house or a lower place in the rick house, and flavors are different. So there are a lot of similarities in the world. You know, one of the challenges for me as a salesperson is going out, obviously pre-COVID, and doing pairing events, you know, because, you know, it's fun to drink whiskey or fun to drink a cocktail, but the challenge is to try to pair whiskey or pair cocktails with a full meal. And I've been so happily surprised that it's entirely possible and very enjoyable. I mean, especially when you start talking about mixers and cocktails and things like that, pairing with food elements. But there are a lot of similarities. You have to be careful because the proof is a lot higher in whiskey than in wine. So, you know.
Which I want to, you mentioned cocktails. So how does that, as a base spirit, how does that contribute to building cocktails with a higher proof spirit? Are there some key cocktails that you really recommend? Look, for me, one of the things that really got me into bourbon was an old fashioned.
Sure.
I love my old fashions. Sure. Manhattans. Those are some really good, strong.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, and those are classic cocktails. I mean, quite honestly, those are my go-tos too. You know, we are not fancy cocktail people in my household. You know, we like it neat. We like it on the rocks. We'll make it a Manhattan. We'll make an old fashioned. We might make a Boulevardier, which is with Campari. But we keep it pretty simple. You know, a few ingredients. Stop. You know, and I think honestly, that's how our whiskey plays better in pairings with food and stuff like that. But at the Aquifer, we have a full bar at New Riff. We only serve our New Riff products, but seasonally we come out with.
Still during the whole pandemic?
Everything was closed for a number of months. In July, I think it was July 7th, we opened again. We've been up and down. We did have a reason to shut down for a couple of weeks. We're open again now. Okay. We're very lucky to have a rooftop on the distillery that we converted into a bar. So it's open air. We have seating spaced out. So we have managed to continue the Aquifer, you know, in its evolution during COVID. But yes, and at the Aquifer, we have some amazing bartenders. I mean, people that are unbelievably talented and willing to experiment with all kinds of things. So we have, you know, artichoke-based cocktails paired with bourbon. And we have, I mean, I can't even get into some of the cool things that they're doing. And they're all seasonal too, so it changes. You know, we have a spring menu, a summer menu, a fall, and a winter menu. So anyone who's local should definitely come by and see what they're doing at the Aquifer. We're also doing curbside cocktails too. So you can actually buy cocktails to go.
Wow, that's really fantastic. Thank you so much, Mollie, for joining us. This is really fantastic and very insightful. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun to connect with you, Drew, and connect with your audience and larger community. And I hope you'll have me back sometime.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And l'chaim.
L'chaim.